So, welcome everybody. This is a Knowledge Bites webinar from BDCC's Southern Vermont Economy Project. We regularly do these webinars to help bring forward topics that are either timely or, like this one today, evergreen, to help people build better nonprofit boards and build their capacity. So the Southern Vermont Economy Project works across Southern Vermont, Bennington, and Windham counties to just help build capacity for municipal and community organizations to do important community and economic development projects. So board development is a frequent topic that we do trainings on. And so today we're talking about hiring your next executive director for your nonprofit organization. And we're very lucky to have with us today Sarah Odette of Hedgehog and Fox. Sarah is a Vermont nonprofit leader turned consultant, and her consultancy centers around board development, strategy, communications, and in that role, she's done quite a bit of executive search in a Vermont context. So we're thrilled that she's agreed to come talk to us today about this. So basically, we're just going to be pretty informal. It's just going to be we're calling it a fireside chat. We have some questions that you all put in. We'll try and address all of those and some other ones that we had for Sarah as we thought about what people would want to hear. And we hope this will be a valuable resource for you. So, I think the whole bent behind this is the best time to think about finding a new executive director is probably before you have a burning need for one. So I'm glad you're all here, and I'm glad you're all thinking about this today. So Sarah, I'm just going to kick it off to you by asking sort of what are some sort of larger picture strategies and tactics that your clients have used when they've needed to find a new leader?
Great question. And I'll just start out by saying good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be here with you today. The good news is there's really no single right way to run a leadership search, I found. Really what matters is finding someone who's a great fit for your organization, having a really clear view of what the executive director's role, and then certainly a really clear process about how you're going to find the new leader. I find that most successful searches are really less about finding a carbon copy of the last leader and more about matching leadership capacity to the organization's next chapter. So some strategies that I find have worked well. Number one is reframing the role. Instead of asking yourselves, like, who can replace Pat? Like, who's going to be an exact, kind of replica who could fill their shoes? Ask yourselves, what does our organization need now that it didn't need 10 or 20 years ago, or even 3 to 5 years ago, if your executive director is, maybe a little newer in the role? What work does the board need to take back versus what should live with staff? And then vice versa, is there anything that the staff should take back from the board? One example that I'll share from a client, and I'll just say at the outset, for today's purposes, I love to respect my clients' confidentiality, of course. So I'm going to speak in somewhat general terms and not give exact specifics just to protect that. But we'll try to share as much information as I can. So with this one client that I worked with, their longtime executive director was not only the chief executive and, fulfilling all of those roles, but they were also a subject matter expert for the organization. When this person had started their career, I don't think had imagined necessarily a nonprofit trajectory or nonprofit leadership trajectory, but had gone to school very specifically for this type of career. This kind of expertise, had a nice, long, successful career, and eventually transitioned into being an executive director while still maintaining those original kind of programmatic duties. And so when that person moved on, the board realized, to find somebody who was exactly like that executive director would be effectively searching for a unicorn. Like, those skill sets don't always and don't very often live within the same person. So what we figured out together is that they could actually break apart the executive director role, have an ED role with some of those traditional ED responsibilities like financial management, fundraising, human resources, big picture thinking, that sort of thing. And then they could create another position. Fortunately, they had the resources to do this, but create another position where that person would essentially also be a subject matter expert, but could be more of the program director. So that one role that was asking a lot of one person then became two distinct roles. Part and parcel of that, another really important strategy is to think through capacity. So having clear-eyed conversations about the salary that you can offer, what the workload looks like, and the support that is available either from staff, board, or community partners. And then I think a step below that is also to develop a reasonable job description. This is a trend that I'm fortunately seeing now in the nonprofit sector, not only for executive directors, but development directors to some extent as well, is organizations being real of we can't ask too much of these folks. We're just setting them up for failure. We're setting them up for burnout, which isn't good for anybody. So I think, instead of creating this laundry list of things that you need somebody to do and a laundry list of qualifications that they need to have, paring it down to something that is reasonable. And then I think the final strategy that is really important to consider is how you're going to broaden your candidate pool. Here in Vermont, as you all know, there aren't a lot of people to go around. And so we need to get really creative, I think, in thinking about who can be in that executive director role. So you can certainly consider people who are senior program leaders, operations leaders, or deputy directors in some fashion. I've also encouraged organizations to look at people who have worked in the for-profit sector or even in government, who have transferable skills, and in many cases have also served on boards. So they do come to the table with an understanding of the governance differences between either government and nonprofits, or for-profit and nonprofits. And that's really important now because, as we're all aware, at the federal level, there have been mass layoffs of some really brilliant and dedicated people. They are out there in the marketplace. They weren't ever expecting to look for jobs. And so that could be an opportunity for your organization to find somebody that maybe would not have been otherwise available to you.
And I think you mentioned thinking about deputy directors and sort of people. Oh, shoot, my internet's a little bit funny. Anyway, I'll do my best. So a lot of these organizations are really small, but might have some positions they could hire from within for. Can you talk a little bit about, if you have like an operations manager or somebody who's doing some real tactical stuff, what are some ways that you could help them begin to gain the skills to step into a more visionary and strategic role?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So I absolutely encourage organizations to look at that intersectional experience, because it, as I mentioned a moment ago, it broadens your talent pool. It supports equity, which I know is a value that we all share, by not requiring candidates to have already, quote unquote, done the job. And it can often result in leaders who are really adaptive and collaborative. So I think in order for that to be successful, organizations need to commit themselves to offering candidates, whether they're internal or external, really clear expectations around what they're hoping the next executive director can accomplish within their first 12 to 18 months, and have baked into all of that lots of opportunities for coaching, mentoring, peer support. And the board needs to really step into its role, and see itself not just as a supervisor of what the executive director is doing and either rubber stamping or not rubber stamping what that person is doing, but really fulfilling their role as a strategic partner. And that's where you can get folks kind of moved in from these positions where maybe they've had programmatic oversight, or they've had financial oversight, or they've had people oversight, or some kind of combination thereof, and bring all of those pieces together.
That sounds very useful to think about in sort of that mentoring. And I think what I'm hearing you say is being really clear about what the board expects is sort of your best starting point. So that seems like, something that we always say too, and even in looking for new board members, right, is be clear about what is expected and what the vision is so that somebody knows where they're stepping in. So I have a question for you, and this is sort of something to think about. I mean, it's funny to ask you as someone who does executive search, but a lot of times, organizations may or may not have a budget to hire someone like you to do their executive search for them. So if they're like, well, we would just have to do this in-house, what do you recommend for them sort of having in order? And what kind of time do you think they should expect to spend in this process, just so people have something they can bring to their board and say, this is what this takes to do?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think as your organization is thinking about, are we going to hire a consultant or a firm to help us with this, or is it something that we're going to tackle on our own? There are two things to consider capacity wise, the common ones, time, and then the financial realities. So for me, a search typically takes about 90 to 100 hours of focused work. And so certainly there are organizations out there who do have board members, or, at least a cadre of board members who could, I think, reasonably divide up the work, and accomplish that. And then there's also financial reality. So there's a huge range of what recruiters may charge, and different, ways that they structure their packages. It can be anywhere from like 10% of salary. I've seen up to like 35% of salary. I think maybe the middle range is more common. It's like, say, 15 to 20%. And let's face it, for like small organizations, that is a significant chunk of money, and isn't necessarily feasible. So I don't think, I would never discourage an organization from considering that it is something that they could do in-house, provided that they have, I would say, the time and people capacity to make that happen. So tips for you, if you're, kind of in that boat, can't afford to hire a consultant, three things for you to look at: communication, your process, and then being really clear about what everybody's roles are. So from a communications perspective, that kind of starts even before the search begins. You really want to decide for your organization who's the point person, and what will all of your stakeholders say, staff, donors, community partners, hear and when about how the search is unfolding. Because oftentimes, particularly for staff, not having an executive director, either currently at the helm, or maybe, they know that somebody's going to be leaving down the line, that can be a source of anxiety. And so any sort of transparency that you can offer to your team is ideal. But at the same token, even saying there's no update yet is still an update, and can be really effective for keeping lines of communication open. Second piece, again, process and timeline. Before you start, drafting that job description, posting it everywhere, think through exactly what the process is going to look like and what that timeline is. So where are we going to be sharing news that this position is open? And how long will we keep that posting open? How long will we be screening candidates? What does screening look like? Is it just simply, reviewing applications? Is it reviewing applications plus doing like an initial screener to just kind of confirm that, they, if they seem to meet the qualifications on paper, that they also kind of meet the qualifications on a one-to-one basis? How many interview rounds are you going to do? What are those going to look like? And then most important of all, like, what's kind of your drop dead date around like when you want to have, made a decision about who the successful candidate is, and when you're bringing them on board. For some organizations, depending on your size, how what your level of notoriety is in your community, you might consider sharing the timeline publicly, both again as a way of keeping lines of communication open, reducing anxiety, helping donors and external partners feel really confident in that your organization is being well stewarded at the moment with perhaps no leader at the helm. But also, if that feels like too much, too risky, I think bottom line, just document the timeline for yourselves and do your work to kind of hold yourselves accountable to meeting that. And then finally, last piece again, really clear roles about who's doing what throughout the process. So maybe there's somebody who's going to be reviewing cover letters and resumes, or a group of people who's going to be communicating with candidates. If you're at all on LinkedIn, I'm sure you've seen those posts where people are like, I applied for a job and then heard nothing for 4 months, or I applied for a job and interviewed and then nobody ever got back to me. You don't want that for your organization. So communication with candidates and who's going to be doing that is super important. And then who's also going to be responsible for all of those interview logistics. So thinking through what the questions are, scheduling, and certainly for anything in person with finalists, those, might be half day or even full day interactions with a candidate. So, thinking through what the design of that might look like.
Can you talk a little bit more, just sort of drilling down into figuring out how to identify those must-haves for, especially at a smaller labor market, and thinking about people coming from other sectors? What are some suggestions for getting really clear on this is what we need to have, and how big can that list be?
Right. Yes. Well, to kind of answer the last part of your question first, I wouldn't say that I necessarily have, a set length in mind, but, remember, we want to ensure that people can feel successful in their roles, that we're not setting them up for failure or burnout. And so I say, for an executive director role, really focus in on 3 to 5 key areas, and then, a couple, 2, 3, maybe, kind of descriptors of what that looks like. And that is a reasonable, I find, kind of collection of work to do. But in terms of figuring out what you need, that's certainly an important question to ask, both for the health of your organization. You want it to be able to thrive. But again, as I mentioned at the outset, you don't want to accidentally be searching for a unicorn, somebody who doesn't actually exist. So there are several questions that you can ask yourselves. One are thinking about mission critical skills. So what are the things that your executive director absolutely must be strong with on day one? And that's going to look different for different organizations. I've had some organizations where, the operational kind of staffing picture is really biting them. And so what they really need is somebody who is great at people management. And that's something that needs to be strong from day one. It's not something that, we can wait for somebody to kind of grow into. Or flip side, if they are in really financial dire straits, they want somebody who from day one knows how to fundraise and knows how to manage finances. And that might be, those are just 2 examples, that it might be something completely different from your organization. Then a second area to look at is learnable skills. So if we've already established, here's what they need to know from day one, talk about what are the things that they could reasonably learn in the first 6 to 12 months on the job. So one client that I worked with, for them, it was actually the financial piece. They felt that, revenue is pretty straightforward. Where the money is going is pretty straightforward. And so somebody who's an intelligent human being who's willing to commit to learning, to collaborating with the treasurer, They felt that, that was something that somebody could learn. But again, if you're an organization with really complex finances, you probably don't want somebody learning that on the job. And then I would also encourage you to think about, in terms of those learnable skills, is where can you actually separate skills from traits? Do you actually need somebody who absolutely has had fundraising experience in the past? Or could you just as easily see somebody who's like great at building relationships with people, somebody who's great at storytelling, somebody who's great at being a public champion, being able, having those traits and then being able to parlay that into skill development? And then the third thing to think about would be your nice to haves. We all have that. And for me, the nice to haves are really the pieces that are, again, you don't have to have it from day one, but they could kind of be like the cherry on top. So think through, like what would be great, but wouldn't shrink the candidate pool. Is it something, do they really need to have prior executive director experience or just leadership maturity? A client of mine asked themselves recently, does the next executive director actually need sector experience, or could somebody who has passion for the mission, shares our values, and has really strong leadership and management skills, no matter where they've developed those skills, could they effectively serve in this role? And we figured out pretty quickly that the answer is yes. So that's kind of what I would suggest as like a framework for helping you figure out, what do you have to have in your next executive director versus what would be a nice to have.
So my thinking is I'm hoping that people on this call maybe aren't in dire need of an executive director right now, but they're just thinking towards the future because that's what we'd like people to do. So if you're thinking about, if you are an organization and you're just thinking about this kind of globally, right? Maybe you don't need any new executive director today, but maybe you will in 2 or 3 years. You're looking into the future. Your executive director is approaching retirement age. Are there processes that you can sort of start, without creating unease or, confusion or lack of, within the organization and making people feel uncomfortable, like, wait, what are we doing here? What are things that you can do to sort of help you prepare and have those processes ready so that maybe it's not as much a shock to the system when the time comes to do that search?
Absolutely. Yeah, these are all great things to think about. I love it anytime when organizations can be proactive instead of reactive. It's really about setting your organization up for success so that way it can both survive and, dare I say, even thrive through change. But certainly, Meg, I think you alluded to this, that talking about succession planning can be really uncomfortable in organizations. I often liken it to talking about death. Like, nobody wants to think that they're going to die someday and that there are certain, preparations that we need to make along the course of our lives for when that happens. And so I can assure you that at some point your executive director is going to want to move on. Hopefully it's after a nice long life and career and your organization is really strong and they're ending on a really high note. But sometimes stuff happens and people move on for one reason or another when you least expect it. So in terms of what you can do now to prepare yourself for the inevitable, one is to document. So capture all of that institutional knowledge, especially for an executive director who has been there for a long time. Maybe they're also the founder. There's a lot that lives inside their very valuable brains, and we want to make sure that we know about it. So document things like donor relationships, your key partnerships, and then processes as well. And not just operational processes, which depending on your organization, you might already be doing, but decision-making processes, like how do we make decisions at the board level? How do we make decisions between executive director and board? And then how are we making decisions among staff as well? Another area where you can prepare yourself is in terms of responsibility, making sure that, not just information doesn't just live with one person, but also that the ability to do something doesn't just live with one person. You really want to reduce those single points of failure, strengthen your leadership team. Maybe it doesn't, depending on your bench depth, maybe it doesn't make sense that you have two or even three people on your team who can actually do the thing. But at least if there are other people who are aware, so if anything happens, they can be like, oh, this is a thing that we need to, think about or do or, remember. Um, Another thing to prepare, and I think this also gets back to the question that I think Rachel asked earlier is, thinking through how you could do maybe an internal promotion. So certainly create internal growth pathways. So staff love professional development plans. So maybe there's coaching, mentoring, peer support, some formal trainings that people can take to really cultivate their management and leadership potential. Give folks stretch assignments. So maybe somebody is not at the point where they can full on manage an entire program, but maybe they're ready to manage a particular project, or maybe they've successfully managed some projects and they're now ready to manage a program. It can look like a lot of different things. And then again, lots of cross training, across departments or areas. So again, maybe it doesn't make sense for everybody to know how to do everything, but if they can at least just be aware. And I'll just, as a little asterisk to this part of the conversation, these things about professional development, stretch assignments, learning about what your other colleagues are doing, that's also really great staff retention tactics. So another thing to consider. So bottom line, it's not, it doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't mean that you're being disloyal if you're thinking about your executive director moving on someday, but it's really a responsible governance if you can position yourself, for when that time comes.
We'll go ahead and open things up to some questions from the folks who are here. Feel free to type your question in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll invite you to come off mute. I'm going to kick it off with two sort of related questions that people submitted when they registered, and that's for organizations that are really resource constrained. They do not even have a paid ED. It's all volunteer, or their founding executive director will probably retire at some point, but has worked without pay up until this point. Do you have any tips or suggestions for them as they think about what are we going to do?
Absolutely. So yeah, I think for those organizations, it's really important to be honest with themselves, particularly the ones that are like volunteer run, that those models have limits, which is not to say that they're bad. I've definitely worked with organizations that are entirely volunteer run, and they are, it's like watching train schedules. They're absolutely precise and do amazing work. But pretending otherwise can sometimes lead to burnout. So if you're thinking about potentially having an ED but can't pay for it, some options for you. One would be to see what kind of support your fiscal sponsor can offer you if you have one. Obviously, not everybody does. But if you've got that fiscal sponsor, some of them are willing, maybe for a smaller fee, to offer some of the kinds of services and supports that an ED could give you at a lower cost to you. Another option would be like a part-time coordinator. So, the board would really need to step very strongly into their governance hats, or shoes, I should say, not to mix my metaphors. But having somebody who can, maybe the buck doesn't stop with them, but they can kind of keep programs going or a program going. That's an option. And then another option for you might be shared or co-leadership models. I've seen this often with downtown partnerships, oddly enough, with in throughout Vermont, where maybe you've got kind of part-time work, but it can be hard to find somebody to fill all of that. Or it's, well, I should say it's full-time level of responsibility, but maybe you can only pay part-time. Getting people to share those responsibilities can be, I think, a great way. Um, let's see. What else? Oh, and I know I wanted to talk about funding as well, because I know that's another big question, kind of like what you were alluding to, Rachel, there, where maybe you've had a founder all along who's been serving in the executive director role and they've not been drawing a salary, but now it's time for them to move on. Or maybe they're staying with the organization and you know that you just need different leadership. What can you do? I find in general that people, whether that's donors, board members, foundations, they're really willing to fund leadership if you can really make the case for them about how it protects a mission that they care about. So you're going to frame it as risk management and continuity and not talk about it as staffing overhead. So start with your insiders, so to speak, your board members, your major donors, your longtime supporters, and talk with them about what's at stake by not having a paid executive director at the helm. Use a time-bound ask. So you don't have to, fundraise for like 5 years of salary straight out the gate. It might be saying, can you help us fund leadership stability for the next 12 to 24 months? And especially at that 24-month mark, that'll give you plenty of time to have an executive director to come in and kind of ramp up your development. So that way it can become a self-sustaining position. Let's see. And then final piece would be to look for foundations that fund infrastructure, leadership transitions, or any sort of organizational resilience. They're harder to find, but I believe they are out there.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, Meg and I could go all day, but I'd love to hear what's on the minds of the folks who signed up to come today. So I'll do a few minutes or a minute of uncomfortable silence and see what questions emerge.
And I'll just also jump into that uncomfortable silence and say, if you did ask a question in registration that wasn't answered, I think we did a pretty good job of weaving them in. But if you came in with a question and it didn't get answered, please feel free to ask. I think we did a pretty good job covering most of those. So,
Walter, I see you coming off mute, so go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Walter from, I'm on the board of the Charter House, the homeless shelter in Middlebury. I think I submitted a question that boiled down to this. We love the idea of planning the succession by having, through internal development, hire a second in command to learn on the job and then take over when it's time. But the way our organization is structured, the person who comes in as second in command is going to be the person who, by definition, handles all the nitty-gritty, on the ground, detailed stuff, which would free the executive director to do executive director strategic stuff. And so how is that person ever going to get the experience and the training to then step into the strategic role when all they've been doing is cleaning up messes 70 hours a week, 7 days a week, 24/7 in a homeless shelter? They're by definition, their value is don't do the strategic stuff because we got to free up our executive director to do that. It seems like we've tried a couple of times and it hasn't worked.
Yeah, that's a great question, Walter. Nice to see you. Happy to answer. So, yes, I gave us some thought, and I think it kind of gets back to what I was talking earlier about giving people stretch assignments and providing, coaching, mentoring, peer support. Um, so, when you have your second command handling all those tactics, cleaning up messes, putting out fires, think if there are ways for that person to build strategic muscle um, with what they're already doing. So, to what extent can you expose them to board conversations so that way, if they are coming into that executive director role in a few years, say, that they've kind of been brought along with the board on those big picture discussions about, where you see your organization heading, what are the different trade-offs that board leaders and staff leaders often have to make in service of their mission. Are there any opportunities for that person to lead any sort of planning or budgeting processes? Depending on the size of your organization, you might have different departments that are creating budgets that get fed into your overall budget. Can that person kind of either take over or partner with somebody else on developing a departmental budget? Or if you don't have, set departments, can they, get with the treasurer and the executive director and whoever is responsible on developing those budgets, just so they can see what it looks like. They have opportunities to offer insight to the process. And then, getting back to kind of like the cultural pieces, oftentimes we need to give those tactical leaders permission to step out of day to day. If they are often putting out fires and cleaning up messes, so to speak, can we give them some executive time, so to speak, where they can kind of position themselves to not have as many messes to clean up and not as many fires to put out, which I know in the context of a homeless shelter is a really big ask. And then, giving them space to fail safely as they are, having these stretch assignments, trying new things, getting involved in other projects. I think if you can, from a tactics perspective, but also from a cultural perspective, give them the space and opportunity to think strategically, then they will, I think, naturally develop that mindset and that muscle.
Thanks, Sarah. Lorraine has a question in the chat, and Lorraine, I'm going to ask you to, if you could, speak a little more to your question about the complexity of seasonal need.
Yeah, thank you. And sure, of course, we were part of a mostly snow sports for adaptive athletes program. And so the need is more winter hours and some lighter duties during the off season. And so we find, and our obstacle of funding creates a challenge of thinking of finding a candidate who would be able to commit to winter season and accept the salary that could match that. And we have already discussed the a consideration of fee for service from another ED from another organization, but we also worry about, in that plan, we worry about partnering with a competitor who will then know more about, and so we've considered the risk of sharing our fundraising plan, for example. So we've had some creative discussions and ideas, but we've hit some walls. So I'm really hoping that you have some other ideas about how to be creative.
Sure. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, I mean, one thing I would think through is, can you find funding to balance out the hours year round? Because I could totally see for some people having a job that ebbs and flows throughout the year would be wonderful, but for others, consistency is going to be better, especially from a financial perspective. for some of my clients who do have seasonality to their work, what I've observed is in the off season, so to speak, whether that's weather dependent or, maybe it's an arts organization that has a season and, times when they're, dormant from a programming perspective. In those off season periods, they use that as opportunities for big picture thinking, for either formal strategic planning, for annual planning, for kind of addressing any sort of operational issues. Because when you are so seasonal, you're probably aware of this. I don't have to tell you, but you're really focused on that program delivery. Hard to catch your breath as a staff member in those situations. And so having that downtime can be a welcome relief to kind of step out of those, either their messes or fires or just, general nuts and bolts of running a program and think big picture for, the sustainability and long-term viability of the organization.
Thank you very much. That does make a lot of sense. And yes, you describe exactly what our environment is in the winter season when our hair is on fire, and then off season, a lot of time and energy, even with the volunteers, a lot of time and energy into the operational. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So, Sarah will give us a little more info about how to reach out to her with further questions. And Charles, I see your question here about, developing especially the fundraising skills to make the leap to be an ED. And I just want to let you know that's on our minds too, of is there a follow-up knowledge bite for people who are looking to think about how can I position myself for that? So stay tuned. We'll see if that can come together. So Sarah, tell us about how people can reach out to you and what they could reach out to you for following this talk.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm reachable by email. I'm sarah@hedgehogfox.co, and I'll pop that in the chat for a moment, or in a moment. And then Meg just put my website in the chat as well. Folks who are here today are certainly welcome to reach out with any questions that you might have as a follow-up. If you are interested potentially in working together, you can find on my website a place to book an exploratory session. It's totally free to do. And we can kind of chat about what you're noodling on and if there's, a potential way that I can support you. As Meg said at the outset, I do, of course, executive search, but I also support organizations with communications, board development, and strategic planning. So happy to support you in many different ways.
Thank you, Sarah. This has been super fun. And of course, there's lots more to ask, but we're running out of time for today. So we're popping links in the chat left and right. So we'd love your feedback on today's program and ideas for future programmings. So I popped that link in the chat, and then Meg put in the chat, in 2 weeks, we are doing another Knowledge Bites webinar about hosting an intern. So as you're thinking about expanding capacity, on sort of the other end of the spectrum from an ED, do you have a project that is well-defined, use somebody to plow through that in a couple months? And that's a great way to give a young person some experience. We're hearing a lot in the news about how young people are really having trouble finding their first job. And so this is a way that you can meet your need and make the world a better place. So we're going to have UVM. Oh, great, Walter, you've had a good experience with Sarah. Yeah, of course. So we're going to have UVM talk about their recommendations for hosting interns, and in Brattleboro, we hope so. As the details for that emerge, we might be able to share more about that. So we'd look forward to seeing you then. And then Meg, anything else we want to say about upcoming SPET programming?
I think that's about it, except we do plan a conference every year, the Southern Vermont Economy Summit. That's coming up on May 12th. So registration launching soon, February 12th. So that's really soon. So we hope we'll be putting out lots of news about that, but that's a great way to gather in person in our region and learn a lot. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Sarah. It was wonderful to have you. I think you've provided a wealth of information, so we really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.